touched to open this evening on the recent works of Gולדשטיין. We have many speakers with us this evening. I will present them very briefly, and we'll then open our discussion with a few words. Following these words, Owen will animate our talks and discussion. So our speakers are Owen, which is a curator and a writer, recently created the third Herzliya Biennale entitled The Second Strike, and just to mention maybe one more show. Owen created last year a thematic show on contemporary abstraction in photography at the Petah Tikva Museum of Art. Susan Landau is a senior curator of contemporary art at Israel Museum since 1982. In the course of almost 3 decades, she has founded the Israel Museum's International Contemporary Art Collection and curated numerous solo and collective exhibitions, including James Turrell in 1982, Anselm Kiefer, 84, 3 British sculptors, Richard Deacon, Julian Opie, Richard Wentworth in 1985, New York Now, Jeff Koons, Sherry Levine, and others in 87, Christian Boltanski, 1989, and many, many more. Dr. Julian Heyman, worked as a senior curator at several museums for modern and contemporary art, notably at Museum Hauslange and Museum Haus Esters in Krefeld, Germany, and since 2001 as artistic director of K21 in Düsseldorf, commissioner of the German Pavilion and the Venice Biennale in 2003 and 2005, co-curator of the 7th Shanghai Biennale in 2008, and presently is artistic director at large of K20, K21 in Düsseldorf. And last but not least, Dr. Eva Meyer-Hellman. Dr. Meyer-Hellman is an independent exhibition maker since 2005. Since the 90s, she has created numerous overview exhibitions, among which Carl Andre, Jason Rhodes, Paul McCarthy, Andy Warhol. She's currently working on a retrospective of Mike Kelly. She's also the editor of 2 catalogs, Raisonné, of the paintings of Luc Tuymans and the work of Isaac Gentgen, which will be published in the future. She worked first with Gולדשטיין in 1998, co-organizing with the Krefeld Art Museum, a major survey exhibition for the Krefeld Art Museum and the Kunsthalle Nürnberg. Now she is commissioned by the Israel Museum in Jerusalem to curate a retrospective of Goldstein's work to take place in summer 2013. Gולдשטיין works with the work of the other. With the works of others. He appropriates the work and the gesture of the other. Not to conquer the other, nor grasp his creation by claiming it as his own, but rather to undo, dismantle, void the very gesture of appropriation, this pure and sovereign gesture, and thus empty out the form of property and the pretension to own and of claiming a creation as one's own. In this sense, Gולдשטיין seeks to imagine something like an essential or a primordial loss of one's own most place and placing, a loss all the more meaningful in our era or epoch. What is at stake thus in Gולdsztein's gesture? The question. What is at stake thus in Gולdsztein's gesture? Nothing less than what we could call here a disappropriating appropriation. Our epoch or era, insofar as we can characterize it and attach to it a significant qualification, would be characterized, claims Tzvi Goldshtein, by the essential experience of the loss of the proper, and hence by a profound alteration of what is considered to be one's own. But in order to perform such a radical gesture which affects the entirety of what we have become used to calling creation, and also of all our traditional concepts, such as subjectivity, property, identity, etc., one must first search, scour, snoop, overturn and reverse the proper places, repeatedly begin anew the process of transforming and transmuting. For Tzvi Goldshtein, it also means to travel. And travel is innumerable travels never imply or suppose a return, a simple coming home, or coming back to what would or could be his place of origin. He's not a tourist. He's horrified by tourism and never returns from his travels identical to himself. Such is Tzvi Goldstein's lesson, one of his lessons. The displacements of proper places can only be done as systematic storage, that is, as a distribution, a recording, a techno-scientific archiving, which would itself be a quasi-obsession developing itself in the technical storage devices. A place, when and if there ever is such a thing, is never our own. Tzvi Goldstein's work affects nothing less than the right of property, the very notions which structure this right, and also all that can ever be said to belong, to be mine. And this effect permits in all possible cultural spheres by folding and shifting the very foundational ideas of what our Western civilization has sought to ground as its own and only its own. Even our discourses are affected by this work, for it subtly shows that our discourses are not our own. They are always permitted and traversed by the other and by the others. Here one can see how it would be possible, perhaps most desirable, to describe Tzvi Goldstein's gesture as creating haunted places. That is, places always inhabited by the other. An other, at once present and absent, both here and there, coming from somewhere else and just on the point of taking off to other places, to another place, never really staying here for too long, and truly never installing itself anywhere. And thus the haunted place, Tzvi Goldshtein is perhaps creating, would be without placing, consequently unlimited. Hence the troubling title of Tzvi Goldstein's exposition, Haunted by Objects. For what is a haunted place? And what is it for a place to be haunted by objects? After all, when one evokes being haunted, the fact of being haunted, when we speak of haunted houses, usually it is to invoke specters or ghosts, but not objects. And also, specters, if we can ever even say something about them, have a peculiar and particular existence, one quite different and differently complicated than that of objects. What is the actuality of a specter? They are non-objects, non-present presences, since they are not appropriable in a fixed, firm, and stable knowledge. They are specters entirely other than what we could be had in an objective knowledge. It is something we do not know precisely and justly, and we do not know if precisely it is, if it exists, if it answers to a name or corresponds to an essence. We do not know it, and it is not by ignorance. That is to say, that the objects solicited by Tzvi Goldshtein, these objects called back to life and brought back to the public surface or to plain phenomenality, as a specter comes back and shows itself, brought back to the artistic scene, because there is always a scene in art. These objects, once showed, exposed, are so to say spectralized. Their showing is spectral and spectralized. Zvi Goldstein's gesture implies thus yet another displacement of the order of demonstration, of monstration, of the field of phenomenality. Masterfully put together, distributed, dispersed, associated and juxtaposed in space, these objects lose the character of simple objects to come and return, in short, to hunt us persistently and incessantly, to displace us as they displace the whole scene of their exposition. As if a certain anachrony was here the law. The origins and the epochs, the eras, are intertwined as if to mark that there is neither origin nor epoch. Better still, it is not, absolutely not. This would be far too reductive, where Zvi Goldstein's gesture is all about the supplement and the excess of transposition and transformation. It is absolutely not a simple opening of the Western culture to other cultures than its own. Zvi Goldstein is not seeking to open our culture to its other or its exteriority. Rather, he seeks to think through and create by incessantly associating unsociable objects, and through the shock or the clash of these improbable encounters between these spectralized objects. And with this radical result, if we can even speak here of a result, these encounters, which are seemingly impossible for the art and cultural historian, unbearable for the scholar who believes deep down that all which is needed is to look, to separate and divide, to judge and categorize, give us a place of more than one place, tells us a story of more than one history, speaks a speech composed of more than one language. Allow me to close with a quote by Jacques Derrida, a quote which would ought anyhow to inspire us to think with Zvi Goldstein another language for this perpetually displaced place he creates, and to think of yet another type of scholar. Theoreticians or witnesses, spectators, observers, scholars, and intellectuals, the scholars think of all that is required is to look. The scholars think that all that is required is to look. Hence, they are not always in the most competent position to do what they must do. That is, to speak to the spectre. Such is perhaps, among so many, the unspeakable lesson, maybe, of Zvi Goldstein. There is no longer, and never was, a scholar capable of addressing ghosts. There has never been a scholar who truly or really had to, as such, deal with a ghost. A traditional scholar does not believe in ghosts, nor does he believe in what we could call the virtual space of spectrality. There has never been a scholar which, as such, does not believe in the clear-cut distinction between the real and the unreal, the actual and the non-actual, the living and the non-living, being and non-being. And one would have to add here, after Zvi Goldstein's work, between the West and the East, the same and the other, the we and the them, the opposition between that which is present and that which is not present, for example, in the form of objectivity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Raphael. Thank you for hosting us. We will focus on the recent phase, so to speak, of Zvi Goldstein's work, though he is the prophet of his own work, and he envisioned the whole body of work from 1978. In the last 8 years, he had a new phase that we want to focus in. It started with 2 books on paper, and book 205. These books signify a shift in his work. He continued with the Haunted by Object that was first shown as part of the reopening of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem last year, and continued recently with the Haunted by Object in Düsseldorf, and then Room 205, The Voices in Plastic Museum. Suzanne, I would like to ask you about your decision to invite Tzvi to show his own arrangement from the encyclopedic collection of the museum.
Well, I have to start a little bit before that. When we were thinking or discussing as a museum what should be the opening exhibition after the 3 years of renovation, we came to a conclusion that it should be that all the exhibition, permanent and also changing, will be based on our collections. Because during those 3 years we really didn't have opportunity to show what we had. And so this was the decision. Clearly, permanent installations are based on collection, but then also changing exhibition, temporary exhibition, we decided it should be based on collection. And then came the question, how shall we do it? And the idea to invite artists and give them carte blanche and choose from our vast collection, by the way, about 500,000 objects, we felt like this would be maybe the right way. And it's not a new idea to invite artists and ask them to be like artist curator. But I think in the context of our museum, which is Universal Museum, Encyclopedic Museum, it was kind of different situation, different context, as I know it happened in other museums where mostly for Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art. What was also different was that we asked 3 artists, meaning that we were going to show 3 different installations simultaneously, which I don't think I have seen before. And so then of course the question was, who will be those 3? Because the new space for the changing exhibition in the museum just could be divided more or less into equal galleries. So 3 artists, and we thought, of course, first of all, they have to be represented in our collection, and then also in a certain way, maybe they dared or the idea of display, of museology, and this is like we put together those 3, and they were Tzvi Gouldstein, Susan Hiller, and Inka Shonibar. Susan Hiller did in the past a project you might know at the Freud Museum, where she made kind of like exercise in museology. And Inka Shonibar as well made a project in New York, and I think it was in 2007, the design in the Cooper Hewitt Museum, when also he used collection from the museum and created an installation. But Tzvi, I think, was a really special case because I also saw that, as you said, he made a shift, you see, his work, and was not creative. He was, as he says, he's an object maker. And he was not, at that time, creating objects, but he was in writing. And I saw that this could be something for him intriguing. And indeed, we agreed and said that he was like enchanted by this opportunity to deal with objects again. Of course, objects of others, objects of different cultures. And so I think he really dived into the collection. He really went through all the collections, through all the wings and storages. And were very precise in his choices, because I think it was said before, maybe not, but the starting point for him was of course his book, 205, Room 205, which is flashback of 1 minute in a hotel room in Tel Aviv while he was staying here while working on his last object piece. And it was 1 minute which started at 9:25 a.m. when he put his head on the pillow, and then came the stream of his imagination, consciousness, images, and so on. And so following those images and following this flashback, he made kind of objectification of his poetry and made choices of objects from different, as I said, departments, and put them in the context of his text. He picked up 62 sections from the book, and it starts like, this is actually almost the beginning. This first, the start of the minute at 9:25 a.m. Then you can see even the bed, the hotel bed, where the whole thing started, and so on, until actually it's 1 minute, and at the very end, it's 9:26. What is different between, if I would think what was different for Tzvi, or how different it was from the other artists, so to just in 2 sentences to say what Susan Hiller did, can you see maybe here? She concentrated only on modern and contemporary art, photography, prints, and drawings, and some sculptures. And she made more or less kind of conventional, say, exhibition where the pieces, the objects are connected with kind of poetical and very fragile ideas which come also from her own work. And talking about decay and absence, metaphorical absence, and so on. While Inka Shonibare continues his, Inka Shonibare continues his dialogue, I would say, on what he's dealing with all the time, those cultural hybrids. And he found many cultural hybrids in our collection, and at the end, he was the only one who created new sculptures for his installation, which he divided in like 4 basic elements: air, water, fire, earth, and created those personification of each of the elements. So it's just very briefly. But Tzvi, in his approach, was kind of, it was a total approach. It was, like he himself says, like an enormous, huge opera. It was, while Minka and Susan made kind of like exhibition, I would say, Tzvi created a new work. I think this is like his maybe most monumental work he ever did. It's not even, I would say, installation. It's his work. And I think this is maybe the main distinction from the other artists.
If I may continue, so contrary to the second 2 artists, the other 2 artists, he chose items from all the departments of the museum, and in a way rearranged them, like declassifying them, and in a way challenging the role of the museum, maybe challenging the knowledge that the museum should bring to the audience, create this kind of absolute disruption. Was it like a challenge for the museum to deal with this kind of blending of the sections of the departments of the museum?
We did it in the past. Actually, we have sort of like tradition to, especially contemporary art and juxtaposing with other cultures. We did it in the past, but in very small, few examples always. So this is something which we embrace because something which in a way expresses the essence of our museum. But of course we sort of like criticize or we change the basic principles, let's say, of museal classical display. And even the lighting, as he said, the room was quite dark, and I think even Düsseldorf is even more dark and more mystical than in Jerusalem.
Yes, we'll see later.
And this was on purpose because we feel like our life and everything can be more mystical, and this is what he wants. So why to have very proper lighting on art? Not necessarily. You don't need to see everything very precisely. And you can just maybe from here and there also imagine, not necessarily to see every detail. And of course the way how it is hung. So the bed, which you have seen before, this is the starting point. The bed is the height of 43 centimeters. And so all the objects were hung from above 43 centimeters from the floor up to the ceiling. And then, of course, there is no hierarchy. So we are not only objects from the collection, but also objects which we found in everywhere, even in laboratories and in our art handler's store, workshops, and so on, and in our offices. And of course also few, but just very few, his personal objects. And everything is mixed together, so I don't see any division between those.
Okay, so the walls were full from floor to ceiling, and the center of the space was empty, and off-center there was one work, very central work from Tzvi's body of work, but also in the context of the contemporary art collection of the museum. Peripheral Man, do you want to say about the works of Tzvi in the collection, or this specific work? Or?
Not really in the middle, but positioned somehow in the empty space was this work, which is in our collection, Peripheral Man, which is sort of like his self-portrait. And it is the only contemporary work in the whole piece, actually, and because he even on purpose didn't want to go and pick up many other contemporary works. So, and it just reminds me again, like, I just want to, in this connection, to mention his other work he has in the collection, and it's The Wedding, which also brought me to this idea and to invite me, because it's also about the display and those sort of like exotic ethnographic objects and display the way how museum display objects and all the relationship between East and West and so on. So it's a very complex piece. And I thought just he can do it. So.
Okay, but the work, as we mentioned earlier, and maybe I will address it to Julian.
One thing, maybe I just, excuse me, the one thing which I would like to add is actually the thing of displacement. And we did it in several objects, actually many, and in his installation, you can go back maybe. When he is choose the West of the Sham, for instance, and place it next to ethnographics of dresses from Bukhara or Morocco, in just completely different context. And as a matter of fact, you know, maybe majority of all those objects, and objects in the museum are sort of like displacement, because they were not originally like Africa, Oceania, and those were never made for museum. So it's like twice we picked up even Sham, but also those objects from Africa and so on, made double displacement. And then it was moved from Jerusalem to Düsseldorf, so this was again another one. So it was like 3 times, 4 times this act of displacement or decontextualization.
Yes, the many layers of decontextualization haunted by object is showing, really put the museum in a very courageous place as an institution that allows it, and it was a very big achievement, I think, and but something that has happened, so to speak, while the work or the room or the arrangement or the whole mental space that Zvi offers in this work, something happened while it moved to Düsseldorf. And I wanted to ask you, Julian, what do you think are the implications of this movement between Jerusalem and Düsseldorf?
Well, I think that, you know, knowing Zvi for such a long time and having worked with him on many occasions, so to speak, and also having been instrumental in the publishing of his 2 books, when he mentioned this wonderful opportunity that Susan and the Israel Museum gave to him by working with objects from the collection, and he said he wanted to base it, or he wanted to start a whole approach to the collection from his book, from his second book, Room 205. For some reason, I immediately had an image inside me of this future installation. And it was more or less the same, like it finally happened, which of course is a kind of very nice idea, which is not true maybe. But anyway, from the very first moment that he told me about he talked about the outlines of this new project, I thought it would be very interesting to continue this dislocation and this decontextualization, and to bring it specifically out of its original habitat, which is the Israel Museum, which has many different departments. And actually, I witnessed a number of visitors who entered Zvi's project, and they seem not to know where they are. They seem to be in another department of this multi-department museum, a bit stranger than the others, but still it fitted into the general atmosphere of such an encyclopedic museum. And I thought it would be very interesting to decontextualize it again and to place it into a museum which is solely dedicated to Western, modern and contemporary art, into a kind of monocultural museum. And also, of course, because this is his main issue since the late 70s, he tries to create a context for a non-Western art, to put it in a very simple fashion. And so to bring this kind of major work of Zvi, also I hesitate to call it an installation, maybe technically it is, but it's a work of his, it's a sculptural work of Zvi Goldstein, based or triggered off by a literary text. But still, it's a work of Zvi Goldstein which now comes back, having established, at least for himself, this new context. He comes back to this original, let's say, enemy. Because when he left Italy after 10 years in the late 70s, he was fed up with the end of Western art. He sensed very much that this is the end of Western art. I don't want to follow the track. I was a member of it myself, doing some kind of conceptually based artworks, but he thought, we're coming to a certain end, and I have to turn my back on Western art, which he literally did, choosing not Israel, choosing Jerusalem as his not only geographical habitat, but as a conceptual place in the world to try to realize his own context for a future art he wants to create. And I think maybe we should have a look at this methodology, if this is the right moment already, to go back into the late 70s. Because having made this crucial decision to start from scrap again, in a different context, where there is no context for contemporary art, properly speaking, because modernity was a very short story in this country and of course in other countries further away. He already conceived such a non-hierarchical map of his future work in the late 70s. And only to fill in the actual works, step by step, in the 80s, in the 90s, and in the 2000s. And I think it becomes a very nice image of the non-hierarchical approach in his work in general. And of course, if you see this image, and then maybe put back one of the installation shots from Haunted by Objects, you feel that this is even more of an explosion of the same graphic model. I wouldn't say that his piece in the center, now at the far end in the center, the peripheral man, is the equivalent to this little box you saw in the graphic, which reads possible worlds, perfect worlds, possible worlds. But still, I think it is a very nice way to compare his original methodology to the actual image of Haunted by Objects, which is exploding in a way, literally, because the 1 minute experience, a real life experience, was a kind of explosion. It was a hallucination of all kinds of thoughts and images, too much to fill 1 minute, but they happen in 1 minute. So when we enter the show now, we're stepping inside a brain in 1 minute. We have 1 minute in the show, and we have everything. So it puts a demand on us. Nobody can really answer. It's always too much. And I think this is a very important first step to get into it. And I would say, of course, the museological level is one important level of it. But for me, the very personal level, that an artist has this experience and has already developed a craft even to write it down, because he's not a writer. He's a visual artist who adopted the craft of writing. And that's also the reason why he wrote his 2 books in English. There are many reasons for it, but one reason is that being not a writer by profession, by training, he found it easier to adopt the lingua franca, English, his English, which is not perfect. He doesn't master the English language, of course. To use this one as a vehicle to be able to write, because otherwise, if he would have started out as a writer, it would be an unfair competition with the professional writers.
So let's trace, or let's try to trace the inner shifts within the work. Yes, first of all, we had the book, and then the book was a stimulator of the exhibition, the installation, how would you describe this inner shift or this changing of operativity or function of the text within the whole arrangement?
Well, on one level it was very simple. For a while, quite a long while, several years, he was not making objects for outer circumstances, let's say, economical circumstances, etc., etc. So he was relying on what he had on the table, sheets of paper and a pen. And so suddenly when this opportunity came along, he said, okay, I can go back to work with objects. Okay, they're not my own objects. I haven't made them, but it's a sculptor's work to work with these objects. He didn't choose from every department, actually. One department he left out deliberately, which was the Department of Contemporary Art. So there's nothing contemporary. Most of it is in a way pre-modern. Duchamp is a case in its own. It's very important for the installation, but it's a case in its own. But basically, it's pre-modern material, but the methodology is contemporary.
So he found modernity within the pre-modern, and he, in a way, transformed the way we see modernity or contemporary art, and offered us some kind of a point of view that we can relate to it as ethnography or as some kind of a cultural study case, anthropological study case, which is centered on his own experience, on his own uniqueness as an artist, as a persona. Will you agree to this kind of description?
Yeah, he shifted the material base of his modernist or contemporary approach to make it strange to all participants, both to the the first modernists or the Western modernists who invented modernism in a way, but also to all other participants in the global art world today, to make it strange, to find another perspective on modernist issues, but using material which comes from a non-modern background, from non-modern periods and non-modern cultures.
And make them look totally contemporary or react in relation to the contemporaneity in art.
Of course, but actually people are very confused when they enter this installation, this work. Especially in our museum, where all the context is obviously Western modernism and a bit of contemporary art. So they're really confused. All categories lose their meaning for a moment. And as you rightly said, Raphael, all these objects become specters at the same time. And you don't lose all the, you lose all the base, the sure base of what you experience when you enter a museum, always centered on the object. Here you have a lot of objects, but you can't center them as objects of one.
Yeah, I think something which was for me very stunning, you kind of, if you're used to modern art museums and you're used to seeing Picasso's, there's a kind of tradition, a kind of academic tradition to show Picasso with kind of Negro, with African masks. And they're always, I think, misused. I mean, we know this, we know about this fascination of Picasso and the early modernist with this kind of sculpture. And I think what Sweet did, and he included African masks, and I've never seen African masks so much in a Western context in their own right. I mean, of course they're out of place, and we will never be able, even in our global little village, be able to understand what they're about. And this is also not the question that we understand what they're about. I think Sweet gave them their own, he would say, have their own ontology back. I mean, they're really objects in their own right. Of course, he used them, he objectified them, he contextualized them into a contemporary context. But at the same time, very paradoxically, they get their own life back. And I think this was the most stunning moment for me, to see these African masks there. So he made the bridge really between what we call world art, global art, or whatever. And I think this is, for me, one of the biggest achievements of this installation. And I mean, you could go through all the departments now. For me, it was just because of this Picasso knowledge, and that I was kind of sometimes very angry about these shows, putting modernism together with kind of naive art, or what people call naive art, Negro art. So this was very stunning.
Right. Eva already put it very beautifully, this paradox of all this, I mean, this contemporary and modern and so on. It is a contemporary work in the end, of course. But what I would like to point out also is something maybe more like technical, or maybe more prosaic, is the way how Sweet did all this. It was amazing to see how he built. I mean, if you see vitrines and you see the way how all those objects are hung or displayed, this is all Sweet. Up to the latest, I mean, the tiniest detail, every nail. And if we didn't put things like precisely on millimeters as it has to be, so it is like not correct, but you can imagine he made first huge one-to-one almost, one to 10 maybe, drawings of all walls. He knew precisely not only how to install each object, but also he remembered there are like maybe 800 or more objects. He all, I mean, remembers precisely each of them, where and how to hang them, and what is the context of each of them, and relationship between each of them. So it was also amazing to see the development from this point of view, view. I wanted to comment.
Maybe another practical remark, because talking about these objects and the function within the installation, we shouldn't forget the texts, those sections from room 205. You see them here quite clearly. And so this is an exhibition where you have something to read and something to look at. And of course, it's trying to make a connection between what you read and what you have looked at. And actually, around the text, you have a cluster of objects that in one or the other way relate, sometimes very directly, to what is written there on the piece of paper. Sometimes there is a text just by itself. There's no real relationship. And some of the texts are even that high up on the wall, you can't read them. But you read a few words, and the rest will be unknown to you forever, unless you buy the book and read it in the book. So I think I would like to bring it back always to this very personal moment. And of course, it all comes from a book of poetry. It's one long poem. It goes for 205 pages. It's covering 1 minute, as said before. And of course, being poetry, it has this kind of hermetic aspect to it. So, although this is triggering off, and this is leading you through the installation, at the same time, it's a very hermetic aspect of the whole installation, these texts that you find in there. And by the way, there is a certain beginning, because the book starts with him sleeping in his bed and waking up. But there is no linearity in the whole collection, in the whole arrangement. It's totally hybrid and non-linear, and there's no narration that goes through from the bed to the very end. It is just as like a bracket. The first text is from the very beginning of the book at 9:25. The last text on the wall, which is on the other side, so to speak, is the last minute of this experience, is the last minute, 1 minute later. But in between, there's no linearity, no narration, it's totally at random, so to speak. And there's individual clusters, and even the boundaries between one cluster relating to one text and the next one are not very clear.
So if I may try to summarize what we just said, so it's really, in this sense, a new type of institutional critique, because it creates this kind of blurring and reclassification and decontextualization of the museological order, so to speak, and therefore it exposes the conditions that the museum is working through. But on the other hand, as Julian said, it's very personal and it's very psychological and very idiosyncratic, and it is all stimulated by the passages from the book, which try to capture memories, hallucinations, and stretch 1 minute of recollection while he was lying in bed and could not move his head from the pillow. Eva, if we may continue with your frame of discourse of thought towards Zvi's retrospective in 2013.
If you don't want to talk about you first?
Yes, no, but okay, no. So for me, it's very important to
explain, because it's a continuation of
yes.
of the two.
So let's try and trace a little bit the inner shift of this text. Yes, it started as a poetry book, which in itself tries to recollect an hallucination we had in Africa, which was in itself later reconstructed memories by Amri. So we have this text that in itself is relying on other works of art, is connected to other works of art, but in itself is independent. And then we have Haunted by Objects, yes, which is kind of a guideline or some kind of a stimulator for the arrangement in the museum, both in Jerusalem and Düsseldorf. So from being an independent text, it went to the background, so to speak, and then it became frontal, so to speak, again, while Zvi divided the 62 passages he used for the Haunted by Object, and attributed each of the four, he divided it into 4 groups, the 62 passages, and recorded these 4 groups with both male and female speakers speaking these passages, and then the recording of the book were played from speakers that were planted in double walls of 10 on 5 meters room, and each net, behind each net there was a speaker that played a different voice, and therefore created this kind of blurring or whirling of sound. Yes, when you enter the room, you heard the 4 voices simultaneously. Later we will try and give you a you don't know where you are positioned, very much similarly to Haunted by Objects and probably to many other of his work. And next to this room there was a much smaller room with the reconstructed memories, Ariane being in the center. So we had like a book that became some kind of crazy, explosive, exploding installation based on the collections of the Israel Museum, and then it transformed once again into some kind of a sound installation that is very unique also in the context of sound installations, and this installation is showing also other works, so we created this kind of constellation, orchestrated constellation, where there are inner shifts inside each of its parts. So maybe we will hear it later, but maybe we will go back to the whole body of work and to the methodology that Julian was mentioning. So I want to ask you, Eva, how do you start to define the framework from which you are starting to curate this retrospective? Yes?
Yeah, now I have to play the VJ and the audio J. So you have seen this this methodology, and it's I mean, it's not the first show I do with Zvi. I mean, we have a history with him and showed him more than 10 years ago in Germany in 2 shows, in Krefeld and in Nuremberg. Also a kind of overview show, kind of starting with works from there at that time from the 80s, 90s. It was more focused on the 90s, and where also we were kind of strict about it. Was very pure. It was, I can't show you now images of it, but I mean the type of work. Just going out. I mean, the multi-part work he's doing, I mean, this is kind of, we are going now back in time. You have seen his huge, biggest work up to date at the Israel Museum, and this is the multi-part works from earlier years. But they all have in common that they kind of have this reputation of being, and this word was already used here, I don't know whether I can make the word or not, being hermetic, and which is quite often with the audience being kind of equated with hermetic is difficult, and hermetic is not understandable. Hermetic is kind of a loop in itself, and I think to do an exhibition is to open this up, and this is the big goal now for the retrospective of Zvi Gולdštajn, which I was invited by the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, to open up his work, but without kind of taking something from the work. I mean, you can also over-interpret it and put a panel next to it and explain everything. Would this help us? No, it wouldn't help. So we have, Zvi and I, we have since a long time already in dialogue about this show and talking about the works. And of course, what I want to do is kind of to break up this, also the methodology, and not only follow his words of this, I mean, the group ETNO, or perfect worlds, possible worlds. So we will also open it up to more general themes. Now this is kind of the biggest step we did in the last year, that we opened some boxes in his studio, some boxes of this mysterious time before '78. So what I was very interested, how did it come that he became such a hermetic object maker, and where does it come from, and how where did he study, and what happened in these years. And this will play an important role for this show, that we for the first time show early works together, and he's also reworking with these early works You see one here, conceptual works, which he did in his time in Italy. And even recreating one work which is kind of symptomatical for his whole worldview. I think this cone piece, so a piece you do even as a child, kind of to focus and kind of to make sharp, to look sharp at the world around you, to measure the world. I mean, a lot of his work is about kind of measuring and centralizing himself, putting himself into a connection to the world. I mean, it would lead too far if I would now kind of introduce to all different groups. I mean, we mentioned already his traveling in memory, which is a kind of an introspection of his inner side, like this reconstructed memories, Larry and B. But there's also a counterpiece to that, which is the reconstructed memories, where it's kind of almost like a schedule of his travels out of Jerusalem, where he was always looking for other culture, other Hermetic cultures, and other things in the world where he could relate himself and kind of also redefine his position and center himself again. And then there will be, I mean, other groups, for example, like the more sensual groups, like dealing with photonology and the metaphors of biology and climate, which is something like this. So this will be one part to kind of decipher it from juxtaposition these works with early, more conceptual pieces, less object-based pieces, more kind of really counting pieces, working with scales, very conceptual work, but working with language in the 70s. This is one approach, kind of from out the work, and the other approach is that we will create something like an archive of materials which kind of accumulate over the years. So you will, as a visitor, you will have the possibility of two entrances, and one entrance will be through an archive, which means going through his head and going through materials, through film materials, through paper cutouts, through books he was interested in. And that's how we try to open up this work.
So maybe it's very interesting because throughout the years his project, if I may put it like this, was to create his own context, yes, and because he was feeling, if I may speak for him, that Israel as a place for contemporary art offers a weak context, a minor context. Therefore, the project was to create his own context and to create his own system-like hermetic environment, and he therefore used text in order next to his wall object in order to create this context, and he, as you said, centered himself and measuring himself according to other cultures and other places and other times. So it's very, I would like to hear from you how do you perceive this hermetic attitude today, and how would you your goal is, as you said, your goal is not to keep this hermetic attitude, but rather to open it, yes?
I mean, so you don't understand me wrong, keep your hermeticness. It's just, I mean, I just distinguish what an artist does and what an exhibition maker has to do. Because it wouldn't help him, it wouldn't help us if we wouldn't understand it. If we wouldn't have get a little some doors to open, how can we relate to that? How can we learn from that? How can we profit from that? And that's I think the task of a curator, which I think is a task of mediating. I have to mediate what he's doing, and I think what he's doing is pretty spectacular. And I mean, nowadays everybody talks about globalism and global artists, and artists working somewhere in the middle of nowhere or relating to other cultures are so I mean, wait a moment, he did this, and he started to think about, there's another third world, about a kind of symmetrical anthropologies in the late 70s. So the others were still in their diapers, this artist of today. So, and I think this has to be rediscovered, how much he is part of this discourse, but without going, I don't know, going to an African tribe and learning how to knit there, and taking it back as a folkloristic thing. I mean, he was really interested in these cultures and kind of juxtaposing his own position with that. Not, I think it would be a question, did he appropriate this for him? No, I think it's just juxtaposition, and this symmetrical anthropology he's interested in. And I think it could teach us a lot about this whole discussion now about the other, us and the other, or this constant discussion now of inclusion or exclusion of the other. I mean, this is long over that we talk that way, that there is the other. Meanwhile, we talk about how to talk about this, how to describe this, and how to make this one project, that we are different. It's not about you become like I am or I become like you are. No, we have to share this world together. But I think it's very nice if people have distinct positions. And he is a great example for that, having a distinct position, but very aware of the global situation and pretty much before the fact.
Julian?
What am I supposed to say?
No, we traced a very...
Mr. Sweet's work. I think there are several reasons why he's interested in things hermetic. One reason is, and that has to do with his trips, which were mentioned before, because he was following this kind of secret guideline, trying to explore, as far as he could, societies, small ones, communities, that are kind of hermetic, that somehow manage, according to some rules he doesn't know as a modern person, to stay somehow out of the modern development, who somehow managed to survive as islands. And he was interested in those rules, that's one thing. The other thing is, of course, there's one word, we saw it briefly here, which is called the limits of my knowledge. Are there limits of my knowledge? Of course, we all know that. But in theory, we still believe that if we live long enough, if we try hard enough, we can know everything there is in the world, and we become enlightened. I remember, just comes to my mind again, like 2 years ago in the very north of Europe, we had a discussion about Swee's work with students. And suddenly there was the question whether Swee believes in the Enlightenment or not. Whether the Enlightenment is still a valuable concept today. And I suddenly thought, well, maybe, but Enlightenment needs a new lover. And maybe the Hermetic is the new lover of the Enlightenment. Well, this is a very metaphorical expression, but just to tell you that Swee is not explaining the world to you. He's also pointing to the limits of what each of us could explain about the world. And you have to accept that fact, that there are dark spaces. There will always be dark spaces to you. You can't penetrate them, because crossing boundaries, expanding boundaries, crossing frontiers, crossing boundaries means also, for example, to invade the territory of others. So it's not only a mind-expanding thing to always expand boundaries, which was one of the basic ideas of modernity, but also you have to know that you are invading the territory of others, and possibly not bringing something there, not taking something from there, but just going into a blank space.
But I want to follow something you said, that he is more than showing dark places, he's concealing spaces, yes? And either in the work we see now, black box, or in the mythologies, there is always hidden presences that are not revealed, and rather concealed from the sight of the viewer. So part of his hermetic attitude and his way to create his own context was to conceal rather than show. Yes, always to hide things. Yes, we don't know conceal what there's inside this black box. Yes, and in Greek mythology, there is this bar that is in the right side of the world that goes from one side of the world to the other side, as we see it right. So we have over the years used this kind of strategy in order to create his own context, either by text, either by concealing. Maybe I'm too, maybe I schematize his work, maybe it should be articulated differently, but there is this concealment and there is writing his own text in order to create the context and relying on this text while doing the work or while creating this kind of controlling over its own interpretation and meaning. So we saw that part of the systematic, hermetic attitude that is stimulating and activating this body of work is interweaved with, as much as it is based on concealment, it is based on opening up and measuring and relating, and I think it's a very interesting guideline in order to communicate his work. Okay, maybe we approach the audience with questions. Somebody?
And maybe we invite Sui himself to join us on the table now. Maybe in the meantime you can play a bit of this, the voices, just for a little break, 1 or 2 minutes. Yeah? Okay.
So we just heard the 4 voices, actually 6 voices, all together, played simultaneously. Here we see a detail, a very amazing detail from the wall, the way the nets are arranged is also connected to counted by objects, because the lowest row of nets is again 43 centimeters, which is the height of Swiss. Continuing the act of measuring and the self-centering and the opening up in relation to himself of his own experiences. Maybe I will ask you to you create very, very interesting equations between like you create your own aesthetics in order to change our point of view about how we see the West, but the more you offer us a point of view that is very, very unique and juxtapose politics of representation with aesthetics. So maybe you will tell us something about it.
I came back to Jerusalem in '78 after being in Italy, in Milan for 10 years. And I knew Western art quite well. I was the assistant for a week, one of the assistants. And I was very close to contemporary art at the time, the modern art, or the modern art. you are not accepted in the Western part of the world, if you are not renounce something from yourself. I mean, you're forced to leave behind many things. And maybe for myself it was too many things. And I felt this, and somehow I decided to go back in a place where it is not in the focus or not centered. The Western mind is far from the Western eye, from the Western consciousness, in places which are the spot is not evident, where from this darkness darkness of the consciousness, to try to build up something new kind of contextual references, those kind of internal jokes of the Western culture, which I mean internal discourses, because a cube is only a cube, but in the Western art it's an internal joke. People only from outside they understand that this is a work of art. People from outside they don't understand it. So you need to be aware and to be, it's an effort to learn. It's an effort to learn others' consciousness. And if you're an outsider, this effort is a trauma, because it's a big effort. It's a big psychological effort. You betray yourself, but not in the way you want to betray yourself. So, because you are forced to betray yourself, not that you choose it. And there's a big difference. It was a big difference for me, and that's was the reason that I centered myself in Jerusalem somehow. There are works here which are talking about distance and differences, or about a cultural attraction, but there are other works which are talking about being central. And my travelings, for example, which are have a big, this kind of life experience, are very important for my art. I was traveling, choosing one of my series of traveling, choosing the boundary of the Western tradition as a grund, as something on which to build something contemporary context with other type of references, which are not necessarily anymore in the modern, because this kind of formula that modernity generates modernity, I was filled up. And I tried to build up another formula, which is for me, is pre-modern, able even to create contemporaneity, yes, or another type of modern, whatever, or hyper-modern. There are many different distinctions nowadays about those definitions. So it was very important. The other aspect, I understood that radicalization, it's not possible outside the Western culture anymore. All those kind of attitudes, which were very radical, from conceptual art to art and language, and then where, you know? So it was not possible anymore. So I decided that on this base, I want to build a new building, a new fantasy, a new something. And for this, I needed to create new references in other, outside of the known Western context. So my travelings in monasteries, from Athos, from the Greek Orthodox, from the Byzantine culture, not to the Catholic part of the Western culture, but to the Eastern, and traveling from Athos, if you have the map in front of you, down to Ethiopia, all the Middle East and down to Ethiopia, a kind of autonomy, kind of Christianity, which are a system of beliefs which is independent. It was always independent from the Western culture, by Byzantine culture. So I tried, the same way that I tried to check constructivism as a form of being peripheral, but being revolutionary at the same time. So I tried in this kind of nowhere, in this kind of known place of the consciousness of the contemporary art, to map new references. And not only, but as I arrived to the conclusion, there is no any more difference in my works between fantasy and theory, between context and ontology. between aesthetic and concept, between biography and ideology, between being central and geographically peripheral. So this is my model on which I work. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. Any questions from the public? Yes.
You were talking about like expanding the experience and the references that you use in your artwork, but in the moment when entering an exhibition, we have no doubt that we face exhibition of contemporary conceptual art. So how do you explain it? Like, I mean, you use another aesthetics, how does it influence the result? Your experience with all this kind of stuff?
It's a question to the exhibition maker.
Or maybe no, the artist.
I mean, it is a conceptual art, but I mean, the mediating in an exhibition, and we discussed this a lot. I mean, if Sui would do the show himself, it would definitely look different from if we wouldn't work together. So we discuss it a lot, what is understandable, or how strict can we be in certain parts to be highly conceptual, and in other parts to be highly, I think it's always such a negative word, but to be educative and be pedagogical, which
You said it's hermetic. How can it be?
it can be. I mean, that's our job in museums and as curators to open this up and to make people understand. I don't want to kind of push it into the head and just talk Kiswahili and they don't understand Kiswahili. I mean, then they don't understand what I talk about. So I need to find ways as in an exhibition how to construct this exhibition to make it understandable. So the idea now for the Israel Museum is to have two entrances to the show. So you can choose. One entrance is you're jumping right into the work, right into a very attractive work called Bibau, which deals with the metaphor of climate, and you're surrounded by climatic tabellas and by a huge sculpture. So you can, if you at a certain, I mean, I think you can decipher that, you can get into that, but even, I mean, there are different kinds of visitors. For sure, artists have a different sensibility than someone working in a car body shop or so, or whatever. So probably then you would choose the other entrance and you would go through a kind of archive. And this archive I'm going to construct. And I will present a lot of things which I know from his archives, and he allowed me to go really deep into his drawers to look at, and probably you can show something from the Orange Catalogue, also what we started there. Aureo reminded me today. If you show them, for example, the book where he took the tabellas to construct the work, where he took the climatic tabellas from. This would be one thing to.
Too small. You can't.
Yeah. So that's where we started. So I call it kind of source material, reference material, and so it will be like a visual archive with different materials. So I not only would show their source material, we are also producing a lot of film footage, which is some things which interest Sri, which I then film, or I interview them about certain things. So it's a very different kind of material. There will be also very political texts, or there will be film collages of earlier work which very much remind you of Russian constructivism. So I think the overall of an archive the archive will teach you how to look at things. And then you will, through the archive, you will enter the show. The show, I don't think it's such a good idea in shows to have long explanation text next to the works. I think the works are visual, and they're in a certain way visual, and they should be kept like that. And they should also keep their hermeticness. But I think I still have this ideal of an exhibition which can teach and can put the viewer to a level where he or she understands certain points of it, or where he or she is kind of guided a little bit and given some help how to understand these things. Does it help?
Yeah.
I would like to thank all the... No, I don't know. Question, your question. Okay, okay. Look, the myth of the Western myth of demystification that make it transparent, to make everything transparent, is never ending. I mean, every process of knowledge create new mysteries. So I am not worried about to be opened completely, or there are always new mysteries. It's never come to an end. But this is a wonderful traveling. This is traveling in our minds. We are all tourists in the other's minds.
So you can imagine how many discussions we have during the preparation of this show.
Yes, you spoke about the importance of this collection of objects as a totality, as an ensemble. But I think you didn't speak enough about the importance of the object themselves, the poetical dimension of each object, the beauty of each object for itself. And in this sense, what Gולדשטיין is doing, I think it has something to do also with the surrealistic approach, which means taking everyday's object and by a process of displacement, revealing the strange beauty of this object. And I see also a kind of a link with André Breton's collection of objects, and also with the idea to expose André Breton's collections as a work of art for itself. I think it was shown in Centre Pompidou 2 years ago, and now it's a part of Centre Pompidou collection. So can you speak a little bit about this aspect of your work? Thank you.
I can't answer for the artist, of course, but this example of the famous wall of objects from diverse cultures put together by André Breton, whether it is meant to be artwork or not, it's another question. But I think it comes up several times. We had a discussion about this with several people visiting the show in Düsseldorf recently. I think the main difference, of course, is the perspective. Perspective with which surrealists, or somebody like Breton in particular, put together those objects from diverse cultures. And the inverse perspective of Gולdsztein, how he puts these objects together. Maybe we have a detail somewhere. This is maybe not a perfect example. Do you have the Duchamp, the typewriter? But you're absolutely right. We should go a little bit into the details and to look at the objects and to look into the relationships between the objects and the text. But then, of course, we would have to read from the book, and I think it's too much for such a big audience here now. But you see on the left, for example, you see one of the very few items of modern art. It's the one, can you point it with the arrow? Yeah, you can, of course. You can point to the famous typewriter cover by Marcel Duchamp. It's something, a device to hide something. And Sweet put it together, and you can barely recognize a number of photographs, for example this one, all showing women in burqas or in other kind of garments hiding their face or their body. So he's kind of decontextualizing the work, the epitomic work of modern art, and pretending that he doesn't know what it is, that it doesn't know its context, and puts it into a different context, into a context where it shows many kinds of ways to hide people.
I just want to add maybe that shifting meanings and shifting context. This is what we suppose to artists used to do since I don't know. I don't want to say Duchamp because it was happening even before. But this is a strategy, but depends what we want to say with those kind of shifts. Nowadays, the act of shifting, it's so radical maybe. It's going to be so radical and it's facing a new paradigm completely. We are in front of a flat world in terms of media, but not that flat world of terms of origin or basic tactile, the way you touch objects and the concept of beauty. So those things are slower. So if the global world try to give the illusion that is covered by one layer, which is the media and the internet and all those new soft things, still remain under that a lot of diversity by approaching real life, real objects. And the trauma is this precisely, that the communication illusion, it's gives the sense that we are the same, but we are not. We need to bridge the gap also with other aspects of our life. And one of them is the aesthetical level, which I also believe in. I don't exclude it like radical conceptualism, but I have radical attitudes in my unified theory. Okay, so this unified theory is a kind of shield which I build up to keep from outside world, to keep myself from outside world, but inside is rich, it's complex, it's a new possibility to build up. And that's the reason that also to be radical, there are different ways.